I asked the school why my son comes home with bruises every day, and the principal said some parents aren't ready for certain truths. My son Ethan is 10 years old, and for the past 6 weeks, he's been coming home from Westridge Elementary with bruises on his arms, legs, and back. Small ones at first that I attributed to playground roughhousing. Boys get bruises. I got bruises as a kid. But the bruises have been increasing in number and severity, and yesterday, I found a handprint-shaped bruise on Ethan's upper arm, the kind you get when someone grabs you hard enough to leave marks from their fingers. When I asked him about it, he went pale and said he fell during gym class. When I asked why a fall would leave finger marks, he started crying and ran to his room. My wife died 3 years ago in a car accident, so it's just Ethan and me. I know my son better than anyone, and I know when he's lying or scared. Last night he was both. This morning I took him to school and went straight to the principal's office without an appointment. Principal Richard Dunham has been at Westridge for 8 years, well respected in the community, former Teacher of the Year. His office is decorated with student artwork and achievement certificates. He greeted me with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I showed him photos I'd taken of Ethan's bruises on my phone and asked directly what was happening to my son at this school. Dunham's expression remained neutral as he looked at the photos, but I saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. Mr. Brennan, I understand your concern, but children get bruises all the time during normal school activities. Ethan is an active boy. He plays sports, runs around during recess, participates in physical education. These injuries are consistent with typical childhood activity. I told him I'd been a child once myself and knew the difference between playground bruises and the pattern of injuries Ethan was displaying. I showed him the handprint bruise and asked how that happens during normal activities. Dunham leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Brennan, Westridge Elementary participates in several progressive educational programs designed to prepare students for the challenges of the real world. Some of these programs involve physical components that build resilience, discipline, and character. Not all parents are ready to understand or accept these methods. The results speak for themselves. Our students consistently outperform state averages in behavior, focus, and academic achievement. I asked what physical components meant. He said that was proprietary information covered by the program's curriculum guidelines, and that parents had signed consent forms at the beginning of the year authorizing the school to implement various educational methodologies. I told him I'd signed no such form authorizing anyone to put their hands on my son hard, enough to leave bruises. Dunham's expression hardened. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to be very direct with you. Some parents aren't ready for certain truths about what it takes to raise children who can succeed in a competitive world. If you have concerns about our educational approach, you're welcome to enroll Ethan elsewhere, but I'd suggest you think carefully before making accusations you can't support. The threat in his words was barely concealed. I stood up and told him I wanted copies of all consent forms I'd supposedly signed and documentation of these physical components of his programs. Dunham said he'd have his secretary send them to me and suggested I schedule a formal appointment if I wanted to discuss this further. I left his office with my hands shaking with anger and confusion. What kind of educational program leaves bruises on children? And what consent form had I signed without realizing it authorized physical discipline? I picked Ethan up from school that afternoon and took him to our pediatrician, Dr. Alice Kenton. She'd been Ethan's doctor since he was born and knew our family well. She examined the bruises carefully and took photos for her records. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as she documented each injury. Ben, these aren't from falling or normal play. These are from impacts and grabbing. This handprint is from an adult, not another child. The bruises on his back are in a pattern suggesting he was struck repeatedly. I'm obligated to ask, is there any chance these injuries are occurring at home? I told her absolutely not, that they were happening at school, and the principal had been evasive when I'd confronted him about it. Dr. Kenton made detailed notes and said she was going to file a report with Child Protective Services as required by law when abuse is suspected. She explained that the report would trigger an investigation into both home and school environments. I told her to file whatever she needed to file because something was very wrong at Westridge Elementary, and I needed help figuring out what. That evening I went through every paper I'd received from the school since the beginning of the year. There were dozens of forms, permission slips, policy acknowledgments, all the bureaucratic paperwork schools generate. I found what I was looking for buried in a 12-page document titled Annual Educational Program Participation Agreement. On page 9, in small print, was a paragraph stating that parents consented to their child's participation in character development programs utilizing approved behavioral modification techniques, including but not limited to physical training, discipline exercises, and controlled adversity exposure. The language was vague enough to mean almost anything. I'd signed the document without reading it carefully because it had been presented as a routine annual form everyone signed. Now I realized that paragraph had been deliberately obscured in bureaucratic language to hide what it actually authorized. I photographed every page of the document and started researching controlled adversity exposure in educational settings. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a growing movement in certain educational circles promoting something called resilience training, which argued that modern children were too sheltered and needed exposure to physical and emotional stress to build character. Some programs included mandatory cold exposure, food restriction, sleep deprivation, and physical discipline. Proponents claimed these methods produced tougher, more focused students. Critics called it legalized child abuse. I found a website for a company called Apex Educational Solutions that provided comprehensive resilience training programs to schools across 12 states. Their marketing materials showed children doing obstacle courses, martial arts training, and something they called adversity simulations. The photos showed instructors who looked more like drill sergeants than teachers. I called the school district's main office the next morning and asked to speak with the superintendent. I was told Superintendent Gloria Vasquez was in meetings all day, but could schedule an appointment for the following week. I said this was urgent and involved suspected child abuse at one of the district's schools. The secretary put me on hold, then came back and said Mrs. Vasquez would call me back within the hour. The call came 45 minutes later. Vasquez had a calm, professional voice that immediately went on the defensive when I explained the situation. She said Westridge Elementary's resilience training program was one of the district's most successful initiatives, that it had been thoroughly vetted by the school board, and that parent satisfaction surveys showed overwhelming support. I told her I'd never been surveyed and had never been clearly informed about what the program involved. I described Ethan's bruises and Dr. Kenton's assessment. Vasquez's tone changed, became more careful. Mr. Brennan, I understand you're concerned about your son, but you need to understand that resilience training involves controlled physical challenges that sometimes result in minor injuries. These aren't punishments or abuse. They're carefully supervised exercises designed to build mental toughness. Every instructor is certified and follows strict protocols. If Ethan has sustained injuries, I'm sure they're within the acceptable parameters of the program. I asked what acceptable parameters meant for bruising a 10-year-old. Vasquez said she couldn't discuss specific program details over the phone, but offered to arrange a meeting with the program director. I told her I wanted that meeting immediately and wanted all documentation related to the program, including instructor certifications and injury reports. The meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon at the district office. I arrived to find not just Vasquez, but Principal Dunham, a man introduced as Trevor Lang, the program director from Apex Educational Solutions, and a district attorney named Philip Cross. The presence of a lawyer told me they were taking this seriously, which meant they were worried. Lang was in his 40s, fit and military precise in his movements. He explained that Apex Educational Solutions had developed their resilience training program based on research showing that controlled exposure to stress and physical challenge improved children's academic performance, discipline, and emotional regulation. The program included martial arts training, obstacle courses, team-building exercises, and what he called adversity scenarios, where students faced physical and mental challenges. I asked directly if the program involved hitting children. Lang said instructors used controlled contact during martial arts training and adversity scenarios, similar to what children would experience in any sports program. Students wore protective gear, and all contact was supervised. I showed them the photos of Ethan's bruises and asked if they considered this controlled contact. Vasquez interrupted before Lang could answer, saying the injuries appeared consistent with normal program activities and that parents needed to trust that trained professionals knew how to implement these techniques safely. Attorney Cross added that I'd signed consent forms authorizing Ethan's participation and that the district had full legal authority to implement approved educational programs. I told them I'd never been clearly informed about what I was consenting to, that the language in the forms was deliberately vague, and that leaving handprint bruises on a 10-year-old wasn't educational methodology, but assault. Cross responded that if I had concerns about the program, I should withdraw Ethan and explore other educational options, but the district stood behind its resilience training initiative. Vasquez added that perhaps I was overreacting because I was a single father without a full parenting perspective. The condescension in her voice made me see red, but I kept my anger in check. I told them I wanted all incident reports involving Ethan, video footage of program activities if it existed, and the names of the instructors who'd been working with him. Cross said video footage wasn't kept for privacy reasons, and that incident reports were internal documents I had no right to access. I stood up and told them I'd be filing formal complaints with every relevant authority and would be consulting with my own attorney. As I left, I heard Lang say to the others, "He's going to be a problem." That evening, I started making calls to other parents whose children were in Ethan's grade. I'd gotten numbers from the school directory and reached out to 15 families. 8 parents answered and agreed to talk. 3 of them reported their children had been coming home with bruises, cuts, and complaints about being hurt during training. 2 said their kids had become anxious and withdrawn since the program started. One mother, Jennifer Yates, started crying on the phone and said her daughter had nightmares about the fight circles at school. When I asked what fight circles were, she said her daughter described being put in a circle with other students and forced to hit each other while instructors watched. Jennifer agreed to meet me the next morning at a coffee shop near the school. She brought another parent, David Cruz, whose son was also in the program. We compared notes and realized all our children were describing similar experiences. The resilience training program wasn't just martial arts and obstacle courses. It included something the kids called pressure testing, where students were put in stressful situations and physically challenged by instructors and other students. Children who cried or refused to participate were isolated and subjected to additional toughening exercises. The kids had been told not to tell their parents details about the program because parents wouldn't understand and it would ruin the training. David had bruise photos from his son that matched Ethan's injuries. Jennifer's daughter had a sprained wrist from being thrown during a grappling exercise. None of us had been informed about the true nature of what was happening during school hours. We decided to form a group and investigate collectively. David worked in IT and offered to dig into Apex Educational Solutions' background. Jennifer said she'd reached out to more parents. I would focus on getting legal representation and filing formal complaints. Over the next week, we connected with 23 families whose children were in the resilience training program. 19 of them reported injuries, behavioral changes, or disturbing accounts from their children. We compiled photos, medical records, and written statements. David discovered that Apex Educational Solutions had contracts with 34 schools across 6 states and had been the subject of 2 investigations in other districts that had been quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements. I hired an attorney named Rachel Owens, who specialized in education law and child advocacy. She reviewed all our documentation and told me what we were describing sounded like systematic abuse disguised as an educational program. She said we needed to file complaints with multiple agencies simultaneously: Child Protective Services, the State Education Department, local police, and the State Attorney General's office. She'd coordinate the filings and represent our group collectively. The day after we filed the complaints, Superintendent Vasquez called an emergency parent meeting at Westridge Elementary. Over 200 parents attended, cramming into the school's gymnasium. Vasquez, Principal Dunham, and Trevor Lang presented a polished PowerPoint about the resilience training program, showing carefully selected photos of students doing obstacle courses and martial arts, testimonials from parents praising the program, and academic data showing improved test scores and discipline. They never mentioned injuries or the physical nature of the pressure testing. When the presentation ended and Vasquez opened the floor for questions, I stood up and described what our children had been experiencing. I showed the photos of Ethan's bruises on my phone and passed them around. Other parents from our group stood and shared their children's stories. Jennifer Yates described the fight circles. David Cruz talked about his son's terror of going to school. The gymnasium erupted in chaos. Some parents were shocked and angry, demanding explanations. Others defended the program, saying their children had benefited and that some discipline was necessary in modern education. One father shouted that kids today were too soft and needed to be toughened up. A mother yelled back that leaving bruises on children wasn't education, it was assault. Vasquez tried to restore order, insisting that the program was safe, effective, and approved at the highest levels. Trevor Lang stepped forward and said in a commanding voice that the parents complaining were misunderstanding the program's nature and that their children were learning valuable life skills. He suggested that resistance to the program came from parents who were too weak to accept what real character development required. The condescension and arrogance in his tone galvanized parents who'd been on the fence. Several more stood up with their own stories of injuries and behavioral changes they'd ignored or rationalized. By the end of the meeting, at least 40 families had expressed serious concerns. Vasquez ended the meeting abruptly, saying the district would review all concerns and respond appropriately. As parents filed out, several approached our group wanting to join the effort to investigate. Within days, we'd grown to 52 families. Child Protective Services opened an investigation the following week. A caseworker named Donald Pierce interviewed our children at school. Ethan told him about the pressure testing exercises, about being grabbed and thrown by instructors, about being forced to fight other students, about watching friends get hurt and cry. Pierce interviewed 15 other children and heard consistent accounts. He submitted a report recommending immediate suspension of the program pending a full investigation. The school district ignored the recommendation. Vasquez issued a statement saying CPS had no jurisdiction over approved educational programs and that the district would continue operating as normal. Rachel Owens filed an emergency injunction in court seeking to halt the resilience training program immediately based on evidence of ongoing harm to children. The hearing was scheduled for 10 days out, but in the meantime, the program continued. I kept Ethan home from school during those 10 days, as did most families in our group. The school sent truancy warnings, threatening legal action if we didn't return our children to class. Rachel filed motions blocking the truancy proceedings, arguing that parents had legitimate safety concerns. The legal maneuvering was expensive and stressful, but we'd created a fund where families contributed what they could to cover costs. The court hearing took place on a Friday morning. Our side presented medical evidence, photos of injuries, testimony from Dr. Kenton about the pattern of abuse, testimony from Child Protective Services about their findings, and statements from parents and children. The district's attorneys argued that the program was educational methodology protected by the district's authority to determine curriculum, that injuries were minor and typical of any physical education program, and that parental consent had been obtained through the forms we'd signed. They presented their own expert, an educational psychologist who testified that resilience training was a legitimate pedagogical approach supported by research. The judge, Maria Santos, listened carefully to both sides. At the end of the hearing, she issued a temporary restraining order suspending the resilience training program at Westridge Elementary, pending a full trial. She said the evidence presented raised serious questions about whether the program constituted abuse and that the potential harm to children outweighed any educational benefits while the case proceeded. The suspension of the program was a victory, but it was just the beginning. The State Attorney General's office had opened a criminal investigation into Apex Educational Solutions and the school district officials who'd approved the program. Investigators subpoenaed records from the district and from Apex, looking for evidence of fraud, child endangerment, and conspiracy. What they found was worse than any of us had imagined. Internal Apex documents showed that the company's founder and CEO, a former military training officer named Raymond Cortez, had designed the resilience training program based on military interrogation resistance techniques. The goal wasn't to build character, but to condition children to accept physical discipline and authority without question. Apex marketed this to schools as a solution for behavior problems and student discipline, claiming it would reduce defiance and improve compliance. The company had conducted pilot programs in juvenile detention facilities before expanding to public schools. Emails between Cortez and Superintendent Vasquez showed that she'd been aware of injury rates from other districts, but had approved the program anyway because Apex offered significant financial incentives. The district received payments based on the number of students enrolled in the program, essentially profiting from subjecting children to systematic abuse. Vasquez had directed principals not to inform parents about the program's physical nature and to bury consent language in lengthy documents parents wouldn't read carefully. Principal Dunham had known exactly what the program involved and had participated in training sessions where instructors demonstrated techniques on staff members. The investigation also uncovered that Apex employed instructors with backgrounds in military special operations and private security, not education. Several had disciplinary records from previous jobs involving excessive force. Trevor Lang, the program director, had been dishonorably discharged from the Marines for abusing recruits during basic training. None of this information had been disclosed to parents or even to most teachers at the schools where programs operated. The state attorney general held a press conference announcing criminal charges against Raymond Cortez, Trevor Lang, Superintendent Gloria Vasquez, and Principal Richard Dunham. The charges included child abuse, conspiracy to commit child abuse, fraud, racketeering, and making false statements to parents and regulatory agencies. Cortez and Lang were arrested at Apex headquarters. Vasquez and Dunham were arrested at the district office and Westridge Elementary, respectively. Video of the arrests played on every local news station. The scandal exploded into national news. Reporters descended on our community interviewing parents and children. Our group of 52 families became the face of the story. Network morning shows featured interviews with Jennifer Yates describing the fight circles, with David Cruz showing his son's bruise photos, and with me talking about the handprint bruise on Ethan's arm that had started my investigation. Child welfare organizations called for nationwide reviews of educational programs involving physical discipline. The U.S. Department of Education launched an investigation into all schools using Apex programs. The criminal trials began 8 months later. Raymond Cortez went first. Prosecutors presented evidence showing he'd designed a program specifically to profit from authorizing physical abuse of children under the guise of education. They showed internal communications where he'd referred to students as trainees and schools as clients, language revealing he saw this as a business operation, not an educational mission. Expert witnesses testified that the techniques used in resilience training had no legitimate pedagogical value and were designed to inflict pain and fear. Psychologists testified about the trauma experienced by children who'd been subjected to the program. Our children testified. Ethan, now 11, took the stand and described being grabbed by instructors, thrown to the ground during pressure testing, forced to hit other students during fight circles, while adults watched and scored their performance. He described being told that crying was weakness and that weak students would face additional training. He described watching friends get hurt and being threatened with punishment if they told their parents what was happening. Other children gave similar testimony. The jury heard from 23 child witnesses over 3 days of trial. Many were crying as they testified. Some had to take breaks because the stress of recounting their experiences was too much. Parents sat in the courtroom weeping as they heard details their children had been too afraid or ashamed to share before. The defense argued that Cortez had created a legitimate educational program based on proven training techniques and that any injuries were unintended consequences of physical activity, not abuse. They tried to paint complaining parents as oversensitive and suggested the children were exaggerating. The prosecution destroyed that defense by presenting medical evidence showing systematic patterns of injury consistent with intentional harm, not accidents. They showed that Apex instructors kept records scoring students on their pain tolerance and compliance during exercises. They presented testimony from a former Apex instructor who'd quit after 3 months because he couldn't stomach what he was being asked to do to children. He described training sessions where Cortez told instructors to push students past their breaking point and make them understand that resistance brings consequences. He described pressure testing exercises specifically designed to cause pain and fear, all justified as building mental toughness. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before finding Cortez guilty on all counts. He received 28 years in prison. Trevor Lang's trial followed, with similar evidence showing he'd implemented the abusive program at multiple schools and had trained other instructors in the techniques. He received 22 years. Superintendent Vasquez fought the charges, claiming she'd relied on expert advice and hadn't understood the program's true nature. Prosecutors presented emails showing she'd discussed injury rates with Cortez and had explicitly agreed to hide the program's physical components from parents in exchange for financial payments to the district. The jury found her guilty of conspiracy and fraud. She received 15 years in prison and lost her teaching certification permanently. Principal Dunham pleaded guilty to child endangerment charges in exchange for testifying against the others. He received 8 years and was barred from ever working in education again. The civil lawsuits followed, with our group and families from other districts filing a class action against Apex Educational Solutions and the school districts that had implemented the program. The case eventually included 847 families across 6 states. Apex declared bankruptcy, but their insurance carriers settled for $340 million to be distributed among the families. Our school district's insurance settled for an additional $95 million. The money didn't erase what our children had experienced, but it ensured they'd have resources for counseling and medical care for as long as they needed it. More importantly, the case forced regulatory changes. State legislatures across the country passed laws requiring schools to provide detailed descriptions of any educational programs involving physical activities, mandating clear and explicit consent for programs that could result in injury, and creating oversight mechanisms for monitoring private companies that contract with schools. The U.S. Department of Education issued new guidance prohibiting the use of physical discipline or pain-based behavior modification in federally funded schools. Apex Educational Solutions was banned from operating in any school nationwide, and Cortez's certifications and business licenses were permanently revoked. The 34 schools that had been using Apex programs were required to undergo independent audits and implement new safeguards before being allowed to continue operating. Several principals and administrators who'd known about the program's nature and had hidden it from parents faced criminal charges or were fired. Ethan spent 2 years in trauma therapy working through what he'd experienced. His therapist said he showed symptoms of PTSD, including nightmares, anxiety around authority figures, and difficulty trusting adults. She said the combination of physical abuse and betrayal by trusted educators had damaged his sense of safety in ways that would take years to heal. But slowly, he got better. He learned to talk about what happened without breaking down. He rejoined activities he'd avoided after the program ended. He started to trust again, though more carefully than before. He became close with other kids from our group who'd gone through the same experience. They understood each other in ways no one else could. Our parent group, which had formed to investigate the abuse, transformed into a support network and advocacy organization. We called it Parents for Educational Accountability. We testified before legislative committees, advised other families facing similar situations, and pushed for stronger protections for children in educational settings. Jennifer Yates became the organization's president and a national voice on the issue of abuse disguised as education. David Cruz developed a database tracking private companies contracting with schools to help parents identify potential red flags. I served on the advisory board and spoke at conferences about recognizing warning signs of abusive programs. 3 years after I first asked Principal Dunham why my son was coming home with bruises, I attended a ceremony where Ethan and 22 other children from Westridge Elementary received commendations from the State Attorney General for their courage in testifying against their abusers. The Attorney General said these children had helped expose a systematic criminal enterprise and had protected countless other children from experiencing similar abuse. She said their bravery in speaking truth about what had been done to them had changed laws and saved lives. Ethan stood on the stage with the other kids, holding his certificate, and I saw strength in him that hadn't been there before. Not the manufactured toughness that Cortez and his instructors had tried to beat into him, but real resilience that came from surviving something terrible and choosing to fight back. He'd learned that standing up to power, telling the truth when it's difficult, and refusing to accept abuse disguised as authority were acts of courage that mattered. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence for the children who'd been harmed by resilience training programs nationwide. Over 800 documented victims, some still struggling with physical and psychological damage. Then, the Attorney General announced the creation of a task force to investigate other educational programs that might be causing harm under the cover of progressive methodology or character development. She said Ethan's case had opened eyes to how easily abuse could be systematized, marketed, and implemented in institutions parents trusted completely. I thought about Principal Dunham's words that morning in his office. Some parents aren't ready for certain truths. He'd been right in a way he hadn't intended. I hadn't been ready for the truth that a school could profit from beating children, that administrators could knowingly subject kids to abuse and hide it with bureaucratic language, that a private company could build a business model around inflicting pain on elementary students. But once I'd learned those truths, once I'd seen the bruises and heard my son's terrified silence, I'd had no choice but to act. The truth wasn't dangerous because it threatened me. It was dangerous because it threatened the people profiting from abuse, the institution protecting its reputation, and the system that had enabled it all. 4 years after that first conversation with Dunham, Westridge Elementary had a new principal, new policies, and trauma-informed counselors for students still recovering from the resilience training program. Raymond Cortez was in prison, where he'd remain for decades. Trevor Lang sat in a different facility, his military discipline and pain tolerance useless in protecting him from the violence of incarceration. Vasquez and Dunham served their sentences, their careers destroyed, and reputations ruined. And Ethan, now 14, came home from school every day without bruises, laughing about something funny a friend had said, complaining about homework, living the normal childhood that had been stolen from him for those months when men in authority had decided pain was pedagogy. The truth had been dangerous, but silence would have been fatal. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.